Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, a very good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to the Swedish Institute of Classical Studies in Rome, which, as you may know, celebrates its centenary this year. The Institute was founded on the initiative of Crown Prince and future King Gustav Adolf and opened its doors on site here in Rome for the very first time in February 1926. This year we're also celebrating another jubilee, the quarter centenary of the birth of Christina di Svezia. And it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who will be talking about Christina as an author, as a literary voice. Horace Engdahl is an influential Swedish literary historian, critic, and author. He has a PhD in literature from Stockholm University with a dissertation on Swedish Romanticism. In 1997, he was elected to the Swedish Academy, where he occupies chair number 17. Between 1999 and 2009, Engdahl served as the Academy's permanent secretary, and he has also been a member of the Nobel Committee for Literature. Among his numerous projects, he has edited and translated from French to Swedish Queen Christina's maxims for the Academy series Svenska klassiker or Swedish classics, which we will hear more about in a minute. Tonight's lecture is given in memory of Marie-Louise Rodén, a prominent Christina scholar and longtime fellow of this institute, who passed away last year. It is presented in collaboration with the Swedish Embassy in Rome, and I now give the word to the Swedish Ambassador to Italy, Her Excellence Karin Höglund, and then to the Deputy Director of the Institute, Sabrina Norlander. And I wish you all a bella serata. Grazie.
Thank you, Ulf. Good evening, everyone. Queen Christina is one of those figures in history who simply refuses to fit the mold. She became queen at a remarkably young age, ruled Sweden, and then did something that shocked her contemporaries. She stepped down, voluntarily, not to retire into quiet obscurity, but to live more, see more, and think more. I was born and bred in Uppsala, and I have eaten and danced countless times in the State Hall at Uppsala Castle, the very place where she abdicated the throne. And many times, in the middle of a toast, or a waltz, or even a jive, I have stopped to look at the portrait with her mounted on horseback, wondering what she was thinking and what could have motivated her to do the unthinkable. Her courage and resolve remain without equal. She was born into the role of female heir to the throne at a time when women were considered the weaker sex. She contradicted that belief not by trying to meet expectations, but to rejecting them altogether. She chose not to marry, not to have children. Instead, she devoted herself to education, to languages, philosophy, science, and the arts. She converted to Catholicism 50 years after the Reformation had erased the last Catholic strongholds in Sweden. And when she left Sweden, she also left behind what she experienced as a country with limited cultural life. As Horace Engdahl writes, and I'm now quoting you, Horace, life in Sweden at the time, even among the aristocracy, was meager. Someone once said that there was only one luxury, drinking, and of that there was plenty. End of quote. An intellectual, an inspiring writer, unconventional and politically astute, it is easy to understand why Christina longed to leave her land of birth. She chose instead to move straight into the cultural center of Europe at the time, to Rome, where art, philosophy, politics, and ideas were woven into everyday life. It was here that she began to write in earnest. Fortunately for us, we have insight into her inner world. Christina wrote extensively, mostly in French. Letters, a short autobiography, and more than 1,500 brief reflections, often no more than a line or two, which she collected and had written down late in life. These texts explore the values she sought in human beings, whether she was writing about power, about friendship, about theater, clothing, or death. The result is Christina's maxims, short texts, sometimes just a single sentence. She does not moralize, she observes, and she's rarely sentimental. Horace Engdahl, it's a great honor to finally meet you. As was already said by Ulf, you are one of the most influential literary voices in our country, a literary scholar and critic of both literature and dance. And I remember reading your dance reviews in Dagens Nyheter when I was younger. And an author well known for your long tenure in the Swedish Academy. And Ulf mentioned chair number 17. And like all other chairs, there are 18 in total. It is historically notable, and it has become associated with literary criticism, essayistic writing, and intellectual leadership. Another prominent figure to have occupied it is, of course, Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations between 1953 and 1961. For decades, you have been a clear, often provocative presence in Swedish cultural life. You're known for your sharp, aphoristic style and deep literary knowledge, and your refusal to simplify or conform to passing trends. I cannot help but note in passing that you're not active on social media, a fact that made me wonder whether Queen Christina herself might have enjoyed posting brief public reflections or tweets, given her fondness for single sentences. Whether one agrees with you or not, you always spice things up. No sugarcoating, and you are always worth listening to. You bring Christina forward not merely as a historical figure, but as a writer. With your sensitivity to language and style, you make the maxims accessible to contemporary readers. It's not a cautious or polished Christina we meet through you, but a writer with strong opinions and a sharp, unflinching gaze. Christina's Maxims is a book you can open anywhere and immediately recognize something about yourself or about the world. Her words feel strikingly modern. Christina was not only a queen who gave up power, but a remarkable writer who knew how to say much with very few words, clearly, directly, and without ornament. She truly deserves her place among poets and writers. Thank you. What number does this chair have?
Excellency, Director, Vice Director, ladies and gentlemen, first I want to express my amazement at this marvelous introduction that I was given by the ambassador. I have to be every bit what you describe me as, to dare to speak in this room after having been presented in this way, and I hope you won't be disappointed. My theme today is Christina as author. You know, Queen Christina was praised by poets and humanists throughout Europe with the name of the Roman goddess of wisdom as the Minerva of the North. Her teacher in her youth, Johannes Matthäus, raised her in a Christian conviction with strong elements of the philosophical outlook known as Stoicism. She read authors such as Seneca, Tacitus, Epictetus, Plutarch, and Marcus Aurelius. For a woman, even of her position, she possessed an unusually extensive classical education. Her language skills were respectable, and she had an advanced understanding of the aesthetic and philosophical aspirations of her time. The famous French philosopher René Descartes came to Stockholm at Christina's invitation in October 1649 and died there in February on the following year, having succumbed to the terrible climate of the north. 2 or 3 times a week, he was called to the Queen's study, often at 5 o'clock in the morning, to entertain her with philosophical discussion. Descartes showed Christina how one can be a convinced Catholic even with absolute doubt as the starting point in the world of research and knowledge. Christina accepted his idea that emotions and passions are not evil in themselves, but must only be subjected to the control of will and reason. Descartes believed that one could play off the affects against each other and thus neutralize them. This he explains in Les Passions de l'âme, which he had sent the Queen in manuscript. Christina Spell, as Descartes' pupil, attracted a lot of attention in Europe and has remained one of the most cherished motifs in her legend. Whatever traces Descartes' teachings left on her, conversing on equal footing with one of the most brilliant minds of that time must have boosted her confidence in her intellectual capacity. Historians have underlined the unusual fact that Christina, unlike most of her peers in the European world, was not satisfied with reading, but also devoted herself to writing. Maintaining a political and personal correspondence was, of course, a natural thing for people of royal distinction. Literary composition, on the other hand, was not. During her years in Rome, Christina wrote profusely in various genres. She produced an autobiography and several historical essays, co-authored a pastoral drama based on the myth of Endymion, and also influenced the design of librettos for musical works. In addition, she left behind 1,500 gnomic sayings written in French and usually referred to as her maxims. In order to find anything comparable in Swedish literary history, one must point to Gustav III, who was his kingdom's foremost playwright and orator, but it should be noted that in Gustav's era, the second half of the 18th century, aristocratic and royal writers were considerably more common than in Christina's time. Did Christina nourish literary ambitions? Whether it's accurate to state things in that way depends on what one means. There was, of course, no obstacle for a person of high rank to devote himself to writing if he wanted to. However, to put the result in print was a more delicate matter. Even 100 years later, aristocrats and royalties usually avoided publishing under their own names. They had their works printed anonymously or concealed their identity behind a pseudonym or a co-author. It is striking that Christina never allowed herself to be depicted writing. Such portraits never really became customary for people in her position. The modern cult of great artists makes us exaggerate the status of literature in pre-romantic periods. One of Christina's maxims reads, "The pen persuades no one, the sword persuades all." This is a stark view of what artful words are good for and what really makes a difference in this world, the power of arms. Of the usual motives for publishing, money and glory, none could have attracted Christina. Making a living through book sales was still an unknown phenomenon, and Christina was one of those who were expected to give financial support to poets rather than to seek patronage herself. She had fame and didn't need to write for the sake of immortality. It seems that she entered on serious writing with an apologetic intent. She wanted to explain her actions to posterity. She had the ambition to shed light on Sweden's great past and also to express her political and religious standing point. But her talent didn't come to its full potential in the investigative and explanatory forms she chose for this purpose, even though her autobiography is admittedly masterful in some parts. Christina's autobiography belongs to a genre that was popular in the 17th century. Memoir literature abounded and overstepped the framework of the traditional religious self-reflection. Warriors and statesmen took the lead with the famous French examples such as Cardinal de Retz, Richelieu, and the diplomat Chenu. The basic tendency of autobiography is, of course, apologetic, a justification of one's actions, ultimately a defense of the self. This kind of writing was enriched by the practice of the new literary salon, whose participants cultivated an interest in psychological characteristics and invented a genre that is usually referred to as the literary portrait. This was an exercise in description in which both attractive and less attractive character traits could be dealt with, and where one tried, above all, to define what we call personality, the unique combination of characteristics that explains someone's human standing. This verbal portrait art has left a tangible mark on Christina's autobiography, which contains captivating sketches of the great figures who surrounded her in political life, for example, the Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. But once you start describing other people in this way, it's a natural impulse to take place in front of the mirror and do the same thing with yourself, which Christina was not slow to attempt. The page she devotes to her physical appearance, to her behavior, and to her unruly character have had a great influence on the historical image of her. In many ways, we still see her as she has persuaded us to see her. No source criticism in the world has been able to change that. A testimony to her literary talents. Eva Hetner Aurelius, professor at University of Lund, has devoted a detailed analysis to Christina's autobiography in her study Before the Law, Swedish Women's Autobiographies from Agneta Horn to Fredrika Bremer. She argues that the account that Christina gives of her life occupies an intermediate position between three alternative genres: the apology, the self-portrait, and the religious confession. The resulting oeuvre is, to be precise, a chronologically arranged narrative about the royal Vasa family and about herself, a story which is abruptly interrupted before its author and main character has even ascended the throne. Why Christina didn't finish her account isn't known. Clearly, there's a shift in the narration away from apology and toward the religious confession. Christina is part of a tradition that has its origin in St. Augustine's Confessiones. The tendency of her self-presentation is to show that her whole life has been governed by piety. Today, however, thanks to historical research, we know that her decision to convert to Catholicism came later than the decision to renounce the Swedish crown. This is far from the only circumstance that serves to make her text ambivalent. Christina speaks to God and asks him to liberate her from herself, whose life and deeds she, on the other hand, sets out to glorify in writing. What did she really want? Hetner Aurelius puts it to us that Christina, in the spirit of ancient tragedy, regarded herself as a kind of atonement offering. By sacrificing her crown, she saves Sweden from civil war and reconciles God with the crimes of the Vasa family. I failed to find this interpretation entirely convincing, I must say. There is very little of the sacrificial lamb in the figure that emerges in Christina's portrayal of herself. What comes across clearly, however, is the writer's aversion to her own gender. It's not just a matter of problems raised by her position as a monarch being at the same time expected to rule and eventually to give birth to preferably male heir. It's a downright emotional aversion to femininity as such. As a young woman, Christina felt a distinct discomfort at the sight of other women. I quote, "I found their clothes, the docility and their way of behaving unbearable," end of quote. There were also agreeably moments when she seemed grateful of having been born a woman, thus being saved from becoming a drunkard and a sex-crazed maniac, behaviors she found characteristic of men. But her human ideal was incarnated by the heroes of antiquity. Quote, I wanted to give myself a Spartan or Roman upbringing, the kind I had read about in the great authors, end of quote. She used to play with tin soldiers instead of dolls. Later, when in Rome, she would find the women of the Roman nobility too uneducated and unintelligent to merit any interest. Throughout her life, with few exceptions, she preferred the company of men. She distanced herself from the ambition to give women political power and persuaded the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, to exclude women from the right of succession to the Swedish throne for the future. She regarded the historical experience of women in power as unequivocally negative. She could not even tolerate the fanciful Greek myth of a woman's state of bold, warring virgins, quote, I know of nothing more stupid, more ridiculous than the kingdom of the Amazons. That tale is badly conceived, end of quote. She did everything to emphasize the unfeminine aspects of her appearance, behavior, and mentality. And as we well know, she was adamant in her determination not to marry. I will refrain from deeper speculation about the reason for the Queen's refusal of matrimony. She herself explains the matter in different ways on different occasions. The view of Christina as being queer, as the term is today, has a tinge of wishful thinking. No erotic relationships with women are documented, and Christina's general contempt for the female gender speaks against such an hypothesis. Nor does one feel the presence of a gender dysphoria in her case. Even when she stresses her lack of femininity, it would be incorrect to say that she would have preferred to have been more a man. There is in her character an unreserved acceptance of fate, which precludes any such fantasy. The idea that Christina would have wanted to usurp the rights of a man is simply anachronistic. It's not in order to present herself as a male that Christina emphasizes her lack of femininity, but in order to highlight her indifference to appearances, to the norms of distinguished dress and behavior. It's a demonstration of contempt for the world. In particular, Christina was anxious to emphasize that she was a stranger to sexuality. Christina, in this regard, followed a line from Christian legends. In many biographies of female saints, for example, the widely circulated ones of Saint Thecla or of Saint Catherine, the refusal to enter into marriage constitutes a central episode. The young woman resists the parental wish for her to marry, and from this act begins the chain of events that sends the saint on her path through suffering to victory and glorification. We frequently come upon stories relating how the female saint dresses as a nun and is sometimes even suspected of having seduced nuns. This is the narrative tradition to which Christina belongs. Constructing herself as a kind of male is paradoxically a way for her to emphasize her chastity. In doing so, she casts off the suspicion of having fallen into behaviors which were, in the imagination of that age, associated with femininity, such as lack of self-control and animalistic lust. She praises the Catholics for having a religion so rich in admirable virgins who have overcome the weakness of their sex and their youth and became martyrs for their faith. The ultimate intention of such remarks and of her general self-depiction was to strike back against malicious pamphlets that had portrayed her as erotically unbridled. Christina's gender masquerade must be seen as an element in the opinion-forming process by which she attempted to reinforce her political claims. Virginity was regarded with a reverence that is perhaps incomprehensible to us and conferred on its bearer an almost inviolable authority. Christina's explicit rejection of sexuality would otherwise seem strange in view of the conviction of the supreme power of love, clearly and abundantly expressed in her maxims. Also with regard to the passionate letters she wrote to her sweetheart in Rome, the Cardinal Decio Azzolino. In one of these, sent from Hamburg in January 1667, she does, admittedly, reject the idea of a physical union with the cardinal, but as it seems, this is done out of mere necessity, because she doesn't want to induce him to violate the commandments of the church. She writes, verbatim, I quote, "I intend never to sin against God by his grace, and never to give you reason to sin, but this intention can't prevent me from loving you even unto death. And since piety absolves you from being my lover, I absolve you from being my servant, for I wish to live and die as your slave." I quote this from Marie-Louise Rodin's justly celebrated biography of Christina, the first of its kind to give full justice to the complexity and intensity of the relationship that set the emotional tone of the Queen's years of maturity. In the autobiography, as in most of her other writings, Christina opted for French as a linguistic medium, not Swedish nor Latin. It's known that her spoken French was very good. She writes the language with an almost unerring certainty. In fact, the fact that her works have no Swedish original has had the consequence that they have never really been thought of as part of our literary heritage. Now, of course, Swedish national literature, as it's understood today, is the construct of 19th century scholars. The very concept of literature in the modern sense didn't yet exist in the 17th century. And the role of the author was different. It was primarily a learned profession, practiced by experts in ancient culture. The poet was a poeta doctus. Such a man, it was usually a male, took as his task to compile the wisdom of the ancients, adopting forms borrowed from classical masters. Often enough, this was done in Latin rather than in the writer's native language. The authors Christina met and corresponded with were mostly of this type, as were the members of the Accademia Reale in Rome. But during her time, there also emerged a courtly literature which in tone and content was reminiscent of and based on the conversation of the educated circles, a conversation that we find condensed in the maxims, portraits, dialogues, and anecdotes of the time, and first and last, in the rich harvest of intimate letters. It was a kind of writing in which, for the first time, female and male practitioners mixed. Christina received decisive impressions from this new culture, mainly through her French contacts, for instance, a circle of emancipated Parisian women referred to as les précieuses. After her abdication, having adopted the Catholic faith, Christina made a triumphant entry into Rome and was confirmed by Pope Alexander VII shortly after Christmas 1655. At that occasion, as is customary, she adopted a new name and henceforth called herself Christina Alexandra. The choice of confirmation name was not only a courtesy to the Pope, but has also something to say about her image of herself. The historical figure she most often compared herself to was the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great. The second longest prose text she has left us, her most important contribution to the art of the essay, is about this man. It's by no means a straightforward, heroic biography in the tradition of Plutarch. Rather, it must be read as a deeply personal document. Here, Christina grapples with a problem that continued to haunt her, the question of who has the right to judge the actions of a sovereign. The purpose of our essay is to evaluate Alexander's deeds. The description of his life, the exploration of his motives are not undertaken in order to entertain the reader with historical vistas, but to answer the question of whether Alexander's actions were dignified or undignified. It's not about ordinary morality or patriotism. Christina writes, I quote, "Great men do not belong to any people. The world is their homeland. and all customs and usages are equally suitable and natural to them. They belong to all countries and must be able to transform themselves when they want, just like produce. Born for the universe, Alexander thus owed no less to the people of Asia than he owed to the people of Europe. He who came into the world only in order to exercise his command over them all. End of quote. Alexander has been accused of impetuosity and foolishness, but must be measured by a different standard than ordinary people, says Christina. I quote, "Those who blame him know nothing of the divine fire that drives the greatest souls when it has saturated them." End of quote. What attracts her in Alexander are his excesses. She loves his disregard for ordinary standards. Admittedly, he was extreme and went too far in everything, she says. But all is forgiven because he exceeded the human measure. I quote, "Alexander was, with all his faults, the greatest of men," as she bluntly declares in one of her maxims. "God is sparing with such great figures," says Christina. I quote, "Providence allows these wonders, which the world has so little deserved, to appear only as flashings of lightning. And it seems as if nature, after the effort of producing them, must rest for a while to let them emerge in turn, one by one, and so as not to disturb the plans of the one who alone rules as he pleases over thrones and scepters." End of quote. Although she knows that she isn't herself anything like a world ruler, she sees herself in Alexander like in a mirror. The essay on his life traces its origin to maxims in which he reflects on significant historical figures, judging them as colleagues. She empathizes with Caesar facing the Rubicon. In her view, Caesar could not have acted in any other way than he did. He must perish or rule. Great men have a premonition of how their lives will turn out, and they are not alone in transcending the narrow limits of morality in the sublime way. She writes of scandalous queens of antiquity. Quote, "These Semiramis, Cleopatra, and many others won respect and admiration despite their debauchery." End quote. "The crimes of the great are unimportant, and in any case can't be judged by ordinary people. They are responsible for their actions only before God." I quote, "The shortcomings and crimes of great men must be counted as nothing, as well as the good deed of fools." End of quote. Christina undoubtedly had personal reasons for this line of argument. As is common knowledge, she had her assistant Monaldeschi executed without a proper trial. Also in Hamburg, she had her guards shoot straight into an agitated crowd and kill several people to stop a riot, the crowd being upset because the wine she had flowing in the fountains to celebrate the newly elected Pope ran out. Christina openly admitted her bad qualities, but used to add that the vicissitudes of life had made them permanent, and that they were probably part of my person, she says, and not due to external circumstances, thus intimating that they had better remain as they were. Christina was proud of her birth, but even prouder of the spiritual dimensions she recognized in herself. She speaks of the magnanimous, les grands cœurs, who avenge injustices only through silent contempt. She speaks of the star that unites the loftiest souls, regardless of the place and time of their existence. Without a doubt, she believed herself to belong to such a select circle. This was the basis of her morality. We may call it pride, but for Christina, pride is a beneficial force, elevating the individual above baseness. I quote, "Pride is noble. It's ashamed of evil deeds." End of quote. The part of Christina's writing that, in my opinion, has a claim to lasting literary value is, however, her maxims. The 1,500 dictums that she wrote and of which her secretaries were set to make clean copies around 1680. Christina employed a literary genre that was relatively new at the time. One could say that the maxim came into being as a response to the need that arose when members of the social elite openly admitted that the rules of life set down by Christian preaching and by ancient philosophy were not enough. In the modern world, humility, renunciation, and the classical virtues don't get you very far. Literature in the modern sense emerges as an answer to the need of an unprejudiced assessment of the moral condition of the modern individual, who is no longer identical with his or her rank and social function. Instead of varying traditional topoi, these writers, later referred to as moralists, observe how people actually relate to each other and to themselves. What we today consider to be the task of sociology and psychology. But sociology and psychology did not yet exist. The members of the social elite wanted to be able to converse without hypocrisy, without pretending to believe in the lofty phrases about virtue and a sanctified life, much as Machiavelli in his treatise The Prince had spoken frankly about the government of the state. Machiavelli's work was placed on the church's index of forbidden books. His name was for some a close synonym to the devil. Nonetheless, educated people read his book and understood that what he described was how power actually functions. When it came to analyzing the complicated rules of the social power game that we call a civilized life, the Spanish Jesuit Baltasar Gracian was an important pioneer. His handbook on the art of living, Oráculo Manual y Arte de Prudencia from 1647, was read all over Europe and made a sensation with its disillusioned view of humanity and its unabashed tactical advice to the reader on how to cut a brilliant figure in the world. The basis for Gracian's observations is the idea of society as competition. He gives his reader advice on how to improve his chances by seeing through the stratagems of his competitors. Modern existence turns out to be a struggle of all against all. Gracian's art of moral commentary was refined in the salons of Paris, honed with a French sense of the surprising paradox and the elegant exaggeration, and at the same time underwent a revolution in size. The observations were ideally to be condensed into one or a couple of sentences. The breakthrough for this mode of writing was La Rochefoucauld's Réflexions ou sentences et maximes morales, first published in 1664. This book shocked the public with its lead motif, confided to the reader in a sly tone that self-love lurks behind all human actions and emotional reactions, even those that appear noble and beautiful. It has been a common way of belittling Christina's contribution as a writer to portray her as an epigone of La Rochefoucauld. A close study of the two, however, can't result in any other conclusion than that they use the possibilities of the maxim in completely different ways. His impersonal and spiteful, her characterized by proud and therefore disarming sincerity and an inimitable dry humor. Christina met La Rochefoucauld in Paris during her French trip in 1656-57. The Duke had recently returned to the capital after being exiled during the Fronde, a noble uprising against royal power that had raged for 5 years. He resided in the Hôtel de Liancourt at the Rue de Seine. During the Fronde, Christina had protested against the imprisonment of several French princes and demanded they be set free, and La Rochefoucauld gladly received her when she arrived in Paris. She later studied his maxims with great attention, which is attested by the marginal notes she made to the 1671 and 1678 editions of his book. These notes, it must be said, are written by someone who doesn't lose her head in admiration of what she reads, even if she occasionally nods in agreement. Christina sometimes comes up with downright retorts to the Frenchman's wisdoms. One is never as happy as one thinks, but never as unhappy either, La Rochefoucauld states. Christina replies, one is always precisely as happy or as unhappy as one thinks. Or, La Rochefoucauld, jealousy is born at the same time as love, but it doesn't always die at the same time. Christina, love gives life to jealousy, but jealousy kills love. Above all, Christina was unwilling to accept La Rochefoucauld's dissolution of the concept of virtue and his tendency to deprive history of all streaks of heroism. Contrary to him, she believes that passion perfects a man and makes him more like himself. La Rochefoucauld saw all praise as tactical, dictated by self-love and calculation. Christina, on the other hand, states that it would be to deprive oneself of a great satisfaction not to be able to praise what deserves acclaim. One should give praise for the very pleasure of telling the truth. On the other hand, to praise in order to receive praise oneself was for Christina part of the world's petty commerce. It's better to deserve praise than to actually receive it. A cynic like La Rochefoucauld would never have arrived at Christina's simple but striking observation. It's more difficult to do evil than to do good. It's an amazing phrase, but it's also very intelligent. While La Rochefoucauld intends to expose and disprove all human greatness, Christina talks about the great souls, a nobility of character rather than of birth. Belonging to this exclusive number means having destroyed everything vulgar and cringing in your conduct. In my view, she grasped something that escaped the French master. She came to understand that longing for truth is a formidable, unfathomable force. A force that can even make humans resist the attraction of power and splendor. No more French was Christina in her idea of love, which she regarded as the fundamental force of life, the only important thing. I quote, "The heart is made to love, it must love," end of quote. Whether love is reciprocated or not is hardly decisive in her view. It goes on anyway. Every person is like their love, is their love. She believed that life is too short to accommodate more than one great passion. Indeed, it hardly even has room for that. Once you have found it, you are never deeply touched by anything other than the beloved object. And if the hope of a blissful union is lost, I quote, you suffer cruelly, but love nonetheless, end of quote. A maxim, we can say, is a jolt that sets the mind in motion. Through the concentration, hopefully precision of the expression, great energy is concentrated into few words, and this provokes a reaction. One has to agree or to protest, and can't let one's mind flow with a stream of meaning as one does in reading a narrative or expository text. A good maxim should imprint itself in memory, making it easy to recall and quote in conversation or in writing. It has a latent topicality which is difficult to achieve in other forms. The maxim is always on call, so to speak. A certain number of Christina's maxims could be called a mirror for princes. That is, they belong to a genre that was very popular in a time and was considered important, in which political ideas are expressed in the form of advice to a ruler. What were sources of inspiration in this field? A first guess would be the ancient classics, especially Marcus Aurelius and Plutarch. Somewhere lurks, no doubt, the author of Il Principe, but Christina's mindset isn't strikingly Machiavellian. To her, the greatest task of a prince isn't to seize power and to keep it, but to acquire greatness, which is something a lot more complex. Her basic requirements for a prince are generosity and dignity. It's obvious that the literary form Christina adopted from a French model was in harmony with her own nature. One of my old teachers, Magnus von Platen, says, comparing Christina's maxims with her autobiography, I quote, "It seems to have been easier for her to reveal herself, for better or worse, in the more impersonal and masked form of belles lettres, more specifically maxims. The maxims tell a more candid story about her than her programmatic self-confession." Von Platen believes that Christina adopted this form not only because it was fashionable at the time, but also because it corresponds to a special gift of the members of the Vasa dynasty for expressing themselves pithily and laconically. Christina's royal ancestors, Gustav Vasa and Charles IX, loved proverbs and had themselves a knack of creating catchy sayings. It must be observed, however, that Christina in her maxims shows no predilection for witticisms, while in La Rochefoucauld one notices a desire to shock and to dazzle, to show off to an imaginary audience that is expected to reward the maxims with laughter and applause. There is a finality in Christina's tone, as if she didn't expect any reaction at all, or at least would pay no attention to it. Christina sometimes contradicts herself, which is the privilege of every free spirit, and especially of the aphorist. There is no point in trying to extract some Christina philosophy from her collected maxims. In fact, she would have been ashamed to have one. Pedantry meant in the polite parlance of the 17th century to assert a way of thinking that could be seen as square, to assert a way of thinking that could not be seen to square with some school of thought. A person of rank should not trouble himself with consistency, but at every moment give free rein to natural reason. And so Christina does. Her major source is observation from life. There is a consistency in the multifaceted corpus of her remarks, but it's a consistency of temperament rather than of doctrine. Although the maxim as a genre must generally be called didactic, it seems clear that Christina didn't write in the hope of making the world a better place, as the phrase is today. She's free of any ambition to further the reform of the human race, as she declares in a brief epilogue, I quote, "This work is written by someone who strives for nothing and fears nothing, and who also doesn't want to impose anything on anyone." End of quote. What she offers the reader is less useful pieces of advice than a kind of complicity with her writing self. Schopenhauer has said that the first 50 years of a life are the text, while the remaining years are the commentary. We may imagine Christina having passed the age of 50, early mornings working with her secretaries Matteo Santini and Andreas Galdenblad in Palazzo Riario, today's Palazzi Corsini, later in the day perhaps surrounded by a circle of learned men known as her Accademia Reale, later after her death formalized as the Accademia dell'Arcadia. Her political operations were at the time a thing of the past. Behind her lay decades as an important patron of literature and music in Rome, but with a change of popes, her freedom to work for the performing arts was gradually restricted. Her isolation increased. She began to see her work and life in retrospect. She had obviously already conceived a considerable number of maxims when she set about compiling the two collections which were finally named L'Ouvrage du Loisir and Les Sentiments, written in leisure and thoughts. For several years she seems to have had occasional maxims serves as starting points for philosophical discussions in her court circle, and she seemed to have confided at least some of them to her lover and to her physician. The manuscript containing the maxims was bequeathed with her entire estate to Decio Assolino. Following the cardinal's death, but a few months after Christina's, it was purchased by Pope Alexander VIII. Christina's papers later became the property of the Albani family and were confiscated by the French General Berthier during the occupation of Rome in 1798. An officer brought Christina's manuscripts and took them to Hérault in France at the end of the Italian campaign. The librarian of the Faculty of Medicine in Montpellier notified the minister Chaptal, who purchased the manuscripts in 1804 for 4,000 francs. The library of the Faculty of Medicine today has 15 volumes with Christina's political correspondence, plus the essay on Alexander the Great. Also, we find in its collections 7 volumes in quarto with the title Sentenze della Regina. These contain l'ouvrage du loisir and les sentiments. Apparently, the manuscript has been bound together haphazardly, destroying the order of the text. It is clear, however, that the 2 collections intended by Christina were never quite finished or fully edited. They were first printed in the collection of Christina's letters and papers organized by Johann Arkenholtz, Mémoires concernant Christine, Reine de Suède, 1751 to 1760. In preparing his edition, Arkenholtz ordered the maxims into groups of 100, an arrangement that has no support in the manuscript. The maxims were translated into Swedish by Anders Sävström, in fact even before Arkenholtz's edition was even finished, and published in 1756. An English translation appeared in 1753, a German in 1801. The Swedish diplomat and member of the Swedish Academy, Carl Bildt, who at the beginning of the 20th century brought about the first modern edition of Christina's maxims, believed that the Queen's high social position stood in the way of the intention to publish, and that the maxims were written for the members of her Roman Academy, and perhaps especially for her dear friend, Decio Azzolino. Bildt suggests that Christina composed them mostly for her own pleasure. I have another interpretation of a hesitation about the public, and I will come to that. Applying modern psychological categories to Christina is no sensible project. How could we possibly determine whether she was a narcissist or a dutiful person guided by her superego, such as the Stoic school of philosophy endeavored to foster? Her proud defense of herself in the autobiography goes hand in hand with magnificent self-distancing and self-effacement. She puts aside all worldly greatness, reaching out for the only exaltation that ultimately is of any significance to her, that of knowing herself to be loved by God. She turns to God with a certainty that she always has his ear. In setting out on her autobiography, she addressed him directly, I quote, "With your help, I will therefore speak to myself as of a stranger in whom I no longer have any interest." End of quote. If one assumes that the autobiography was originally meant as an attempt to justify herself and to defend her reputation in front of posterity, in the course of writing, she turned away from the human public in order to address a greater greatness and glory. Eventually, I quote, "But you, my Lord, have given me a heart that was made for no one but you. You've made it so wonderfully large and strong that no one but you alone could fill it. You should be the only object of its longing." End of quote. And that is the final appeal of the autobiography. The feeling that the world isn't enough for a great art is likewise the spirit in which Christina composed her maxims, even if only a small part of them concerns man's relationship with God. She speaks of fame as a wisp of smoke, and says that the great men of old, she's thinking of the heroes of antiquity before the victory of Christianity, are to be regretted for giving so much emotion to something so insignificant. Implied here is honor, the admiration of posterity. Nevertheless, it's easy to see that Christina's humility isn't of the traditionally Christian kind. That is, a conviction of one's sinfulness and of one's part in the world's turning away from God. The concept of sinful humanity has no meaning to her, and she lacks any interest in the idea of Christ's act of salvation. In fact, she hardly ever mentions the Saviour. In her own view, she is and has always been the darling of the stars, being the daughter of the great Gustavus Adolphus. Her destiny is incomparable. She's dared something that no one or very few others have dared, namely to renounce power. She has, in a moment that we can hardly imagine, and for reasons that will never be quite understood, conceived the idea of a great escape from the world to which she had been born, with its values and historical obligations. She has prepared and carried out her incredible deed with icy calm in front of stunned dignitaries, with an astonished Europe as a witness. She's not wavered an inch from her demand to maintain rank and dignity and to live the life of a princess, even after this deed. She's made the world accept, or at least not openly reject, such claims. The paradoxical consequence of this exploit is but that by means of her abdication, Christina rises from her position, steps on her star as if it were her footstool, and with the loss of royal power, becomes herself. I quote, "You really have something to thank God for when you have lost everything." From that moment on, there was nothing that prevented her from giving free rein to her thoughts. It is this freedom that she brings to bear in the maxims. Their brevity and linguistic simplicity make it easy for us to overlook the explosive power of many of the insights that she conveys. When she takes up the pen, she assumes a supreme position from which to reason about the human heart and its aspirations. Stripped of her hereditary role, she discovers the insignificance of the distinctions people make between evil and good, between reason and madness. Seen from the top of the invisible tower she has raised in her mind, all earthly concerns assume the color of vanity. Queen Christina's language is extremely disciplined. Like the French writers of the 17th century, whom we today consider to be classical, she has given her style a dignified purity by limiting her vocabulary and avoiding everything low, popular, and vulgar. A small number of privileged terms that are perfectly understandable in their context, but can never be translated in the same way on every instance, serve as carriers of her thought. All this is characteristic of classical French. A few privileged words having a wide range of applicability and bringing together a range of meanings that may call for different terms in other languages. Among the key words in Christina's maxims, 4 can be singled out as carrying particularly weight. They stand crosswise in an antithetical relationship to one another: mérite, fortune, and honnêteté, gloire. For Christina, who was a competent Latinist, the Latin language forms an underlying stratum which affects the significance of her key terms. Behind the words she employs, the reader may sense their Roman equivalents: meritum, fortuna, honestas, gloria, and beyond them the corresponding Greek terms. The world changes, and so does man, but nothing new happens. Men and centuries are more or less the same. That is Christina's basic principle. The world is a theater, as already Marcus Aurelius said, and in Christina's own words, I quote, "He who distributes the roles in the world also provides everyone He who distributes the roles in the world also provides everything necessary to play them to his liking." End of quote. She is, of course, aware that external brilliance and internal substance rarely coincide. They are two systems that obey different laws. But in her idea, which is perhaps more realistic than the modern belief in authenticity, these two systems are dependent on each other. Being capable and honest is of no use if you don't have luck on your side. Greatness is a phenomenon in which luck and skill work together. The world doesn't want to resist a winner, and yet success as such is irrelevant. Success can never match the feeling of doing the right thing and of determining your own destiny. As Goethe's Faust says, Die Tat ist alles, nichts der Ruhm. The feat is everything, fame is nothing. Actually, Christina is at every moment prepared to dismiss her entire existence. She lingers almost voluptuously on the thought that life is nothing, a shadow play, a trompe-l'œil effect, a masquerade, a game with dolls, a dream. I quote, however pleasant and brilliant one's life is, one would be very unhappy if it did not end. It's difficult to imagine Christina writing novels or dialogues like her friend in Paris, Madeleine de Scudéry, who with a profuse writing and bold way of commenting on contemporary events paved a female path in French letters. Christina doesn't write figuratively. She doesn't write to entertain with illusions. I've already quoted a dictum about the pen and the sword. She doesn't believe in literature as a transformative power, however much she was amused by it. We have to address the question why Christina didn't become a published author during her lifetime, why her literary efforts remained in manuscript, why her books were never finished. There can be only one meaning about her talent with a pen. Under different circumstances in another era, she would no doubt have become a prominent writer. The solitude that increasingly became a lot seems to us the proper element of literature. But even when she left apologetic writing behind and became an aphorist, she never reached the point where she would have mutated into a writer in the modern sense. Or rather, at the end of things, she reaches that point, but only in and through the reading to which we today subject her. Christina had no clear vision of her aspiration in the sense that she was unable to grasp the fact that literature doesn't exist as long as the writer addresses friends and enemies, as long as the recipients are all known. What is lacking here is the mystical third, the invisible eavesdropper who listens without being spoken to. The third, yes, because that is the essence of literature, that someone is listening, so to speak, behind a curtain. The literary expression exists to be received by an unknown, or by many. The number is insignificant. Literature is by no means defined by having a large audience. It doesn't always have that. Literature is defined by having a basically unlimited audience, unlimited in the sense that its recipients must be anonymous, must be anyone. The act of literary writing is permeated by the awareness of this anyone as the ultimate addressee of the text. What about Christina then? We don't know. What we do know is that she didn't take the step of connecting with this unknown by means of the logical measure of having her words printed. Nor is there anything to indicate that she ever had such an intention. Yet, her maxims and the rest of her writings were ready to be transmuted into literature as soon as Eichenholz had collected the text and taken them to the press. Thus, Christina retroactively becomes a writer, perhaps not immediately when her words appeared in print for the first time, but certainly at the moment when people whose existence she could not have imagined picked up her writings and read them in order to understand not her so much as themselves. While the autobiography and the essays to some extent remain in the demi shade of being historical documents, the maxims properly belong to literature, whether Swedish or French or world literature or all three of them. This phenomenon, literature in the modern sense, a phenomenon that Christina didn't quite grasp, is the objective solution to her life's problem, a solution that was not yet available to a person of her standing, but which becomes so retroactively in our reading of her as a writer, that is, in our transformation of her into a classic, a transformation that is still in progress, but will one day be completed. Instead of opting for an existence as an author, in this future sense, Christina chose the dialogue with God, which, unlike literature, doesn't allow for the existence of a third, an anonymous listener. She says, strikingly and correctly, about the exchange between the soul and the Most High, that it's a conversation from which no one can quote. She says, true piety takes place entirely between God and the soul. This loving intercourse has no place for any third party. Ludwig Wittgenstein was on the same point when he scribbled on one of his philosophical index cards, you can't hear God speaking to anyone else, but only when you are the one being addressed. This is a grammatical remark, he said. Christina gives the idea its full significance when she remarks, a radiant, secret conversation between God and the soul would astonish the angels if they were granted access to this sanctuary. At the point where God and the soul are alone with each other, literature ceases, a bit like in the third part of Dante's Divina Commedia, in which the poet is only left with the alternative to declare that what he sees is so magnificent that it can't be described. The individual's conversation with God, a conversation without an audience, is, in the perspective that I'm drawing here, the great alternative to authorship, the alternative that Christina opted for, which is why her writings never reached publication on her initiative. But before she came to that crucial point, she did, after all, confer her maxims to letters. Unlike her apologetic writings, they are unrelated to the Queen's project of self-mythologization. Their cause is the heart, let's call it that. They have no agenda other than sincerity. They carry a sense of epilogue, or words of truth spoken when the game is over. Christina doesn't care to please, and she speaks openly about the deceptions of power. Her way of writing confirms the bold statement she makes in one of her maxims. Truth has a way of its own by which we recognize it without being able to explain how. The truth she represents in her maxims is not underpinned by her social position. There is no guarantee other than her voice, the calm, the firmness and intelligence of the speaker, who is no longer Queen Christina or the exalted convert Christina Alexandra, but simply the author of the maxims. We can read them without worrying about who she was or believed she was. She is resurrected in the form of the sender of her text. Kierkegaard says somewhere that what distinguishes a writer is that he speaks without authority. That is, when someone enters literature, the possibility of reinforcing the meaning and credibility of what is written by referring to the author's position and social credit is gone. In modern literary consciousness, this insight has become general. There are no longer playwrights who have their portraits taken completely with a chest full of decorations, or essayists who print their titles and awards following their name on the title page. The perhaps greatest poet of the 20th century, the Portuguese Fernando Pessoa, devoted some of his most essential creations to the idea of the poet's abdication from all human dignity and ultimately even from his own self. The act of abdication, stepping down from one's elevated position, giving up one's possessions, turning one's back on the world, has been material to a Christian's rebirth and assumption of sanctity ever since evangelical times. This is the moment of heeding the Master's call, follow me, the moment of leaving one's former existence behind. Christina gradually and slowly, albeit never completely, committed such an act in her own life. She may never have become truly pious, the point is debatable. She never gave up her claim to royal rank, and to some extent she maintained until the end the pageantry that was the external aspect of her status. Only when composing her maxims does all this fall from the apologetic stance characteristic of her early writings is now completely absent. Having rejected all social pretense, she wields the power that no scepter could ever have lent her, that of a great author. Her political renunciation thus finds its fulfillment in her writing. More than that, writing appears as the unknown goal towards which her sensational actions strive unknowingly, like a compass needle pointing towards the magnetic pole. Writing is the great abdication to which the famous procedure in Uppsala in 1654 was only a prelude. In her boldest maxims, one feels the tremor of the moment when the idea of this incredible act emerged like a volcanic island in her mind. The belief in God that ultimately became her only important subject is in perfect harmony with this revolt. Her renunciation before the Lord is what finally gives her the freedom she needs to speak with absolute veracity. Leaving behind an unfinished work isn't the same thing as humility. And humility was none of Christina's strong points. If she had doubts, it was of posterity rather than of herself. The extant portraits of the Queen give a rather varied picture of her appearance, except for one thing. In all of them, we encounter that calm, condescending gaze that rests on everything and everyone. What it looked like when she raised it to God, we don't know. But when we read her maxims, it's with this gaze that we look at the world. In sensing her approaching end, Christina gave instructions that her paper should be burnt after her death. She also decreed that her funeral should be simple, and her tomb should bear no other description than Vixit Christina anno sexaginta tres. She must have understood that her chances of escaping a lavish pompa funebris was indeed slim. There is, of course, a tradition among the great at the brink of their demise to give instructions intended to emphasize their modesty and Christian humility, but not really to be obeyed. What Christina wanted remains open to speculation. As things turned out, her manuscripts were saved. In a maxim I discovered working with the originals in Montpellier, it's an apocryphal one, we could say, because it's never been included in any edition. Christina takes Socrates to task for his well-known refusal to convey his thoughts to writing. I quote, "Socrates' modesty did wrong to posterity by professing to be unable to put anything down on paper without ruining it. It was deprived of 1,000 fine things which such a great man would have been able to teach it." This confession to the importance of literary communication makes it easier to believe that Christina's maxims were, in the final analysis, intended for the public, though this idea as yet lacked the clear significance it was to assume in the modern world. Some lines further down in the original manuscript, Christina adds, as if to silence the complaint that there are already too many books in the world, I quote, "However bad a book may be, it doesn't bother anyone, and to get revenge, one only has not to read it." Admittedly, Christina had a sense of humor, and no doubt she possessed the self-assurance it takes to exercise the most pretentious of all literary genres, which has so few masters through the ages, but of whom, after all, Christina knew herself to be one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Horace Engdahl, for this brilliant lecture on what I believe in a way is the concept of freedom. But what really strikes in Queen Christina's life is this continuous pursuit for what freedom actually is. And we can see it already in her childhood, striving for trying to understand in which ways Lutheranism and Catholicism differ in terms of intellectual freedom. We can see it in the choice of abdication and going forward to Rome in order to create a social space that basically do not exist. And she creates it, and she is successful, but in a way she is not. So I think that your brilliant exposure concerning the maxims really explains that and sheds light on that. It's an expression of freedom with no actual audience, no intended publication. It's just like a voice in a sort of a void, an intended space. And I'm sure that there are many questions among the audience, and I think that we have time for one or two. To Horace Engdahl, please.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. We heard that Queen Christina was fond of Marcus Aurelius, and we know that she had a profound knowledge in ancient Greek and read his meditations thoroughly. And now it is believed that Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditation exactly with no other audience in mind but himself. Because as a Roman emperor, you didn't need recognition, you didn't need an audience, you spoke only before the gods. So what do you think? Would it be possible to take a contrasting view? Because, as you mentioned, Christina, so to speak, in her own view, remained inherently sovereign, despite the abdication. So would the writing of the maxims, in fact, be the effect of royalty, sovereignty, and being responsible only to God?
Well, the example of Marcus Aurelius is interesting, and in fact, we know very little about for whom his notes were intended. They were, as you know, discovered late. Only basically one manuscript survived, and they have not been subjected to any final edition or anything. When you read them, I read them almost every day, in fact, because it belongs to my favorite lecture. You realize that he kept composing them without looking back. I mean, they're very repetitious. He often comes back to the same subjects. He returns. He goes around in circles. It doesn't really harm his book, I think. It's still very, it's still mesmerizing, but it's not composed in the way that you do when you are thinking of delivering it like a book or like a lecture or like any kind of social, shall we say, social entity. And we know that Marcus Aurelius was a highly skilled orator. You can see that in the letters that exist between him and his teacher of rhetorics. He was well versed in rhetorics. He knew exactly what it took to produce an act of communication in the rhetorical sense, and it's obviously not that he is doing in his notes. And so it's quite possible that they were conceived just for the emperor himself, just to let off the pressure, so to speak. I'm not even sure he intended to read them himself. I'm not even sure he did that. I mean, it's possible to keep on writing and never look back. I mean, many writers do that. Unfortunately, some of them even publish that, but that's another problem. We can't go into that now. So I think this book, his self-reflections, or what we should call it, it has no title, as you know. We don't know what he was supposed to call it. That is something different than Christina's maxims, even if she was inspired by it. We knew that she read it. I I can't see it as a model of her writing, and I can't see the author's stance that Marcus Aurelius takes to be identical with the one that Christina takes in her work, because the maxim is such an intensely social form. I mean, it's born out of the educated circles of Spain and France. It's born from conversation, basically. It's born in the salon. It's born in company. Christina was by no means alien to that, and she must have worked up the ability to come up with these succinct formulations by associating with intelligent people. There's no other way you can do that. There's absolutely no other way you can teach yourself to be an aphorist than to be a little bit more, shall we say, quicker and more ruthless than the people that you associate with. Then you can get this sort of verbal upper hand, and when you experience that for the first time, you like it, and that stimulates you to develop and refine this capacity, which must be to some extent inbred, of course. And this must have happened to Christina, and it came only gradually. I mean, I think it took a long time before she seriously started to produce at least a larger bulk of what became her maxims. We say that they were edited, they were set to clear letters around 1680. We have that dating you can find in some manuscripts, but obviously they weren't. She didn't begin to compose them then. They had been coming gradually, probably from at least from her French travels, and perhaps even before. So the problem is a bit different here. She could have followed the example of La Rochefoucauld and had her maxims published, but it wasn't death that came in the way of such a project. She was working obviously most intensely on them around 1680, but she died in 1689. It's a long way. So it must have been something else. And in my analysis, I try to show that she is part of what makes her express herself in that way is a kind of absolute moral freedom that she has attained. That is so rare that we don't even find it in modern intellectuals. I mean, almost never. I mean, it's not there. It's so rare that, I mean, you have to look all through world literature and you can find, well, perhaps 4 or 5 examples that could be compared to her. This complete disregard of every objection that could be raised against her statements. It's so obvious that she doesn't care the least what people think about what she thinks. And very, very few people, even philosophers, even people with reputation for being provocative or being political aggressors or anything, ever come to that point. Very, very few. And this gives her maxims a sort of a unique ring. And in a way, she's right that the world doesn't deserve them. I mean, I think she feels that. Who could read this? Who could assume this? Who could understand what I'm really saying, what I'm really talking about? And this, of course, has in a bit has counteracted the possible transformation that could have come about in the final years, making her an author in the true sense. It never happened because she was too much above literature, in a sense, and she still is, in a sense. That's the spooky thing. I worked with these maxims. I translated all the 1,500 maxims. I worked for more than a year with this book, and it has an effect on you that is close to dangerous, I would say, because it sort of sets you free from every normal moral consideration, and it also sets you free in a strange way from your interest in yourself. Perhaps it mostly resembles Zen Buddhism or something. This complete freedom with which she looks at herself and the world and all the norms and judgments that she comes up against in the contemporary world. And so I really feel that this work is in a sense unique. And also it's difficult to read because the formulations are so simple. They're so simple. I mean, like the one I quoted about easier to do good than to do evil. I mean, they are that simple, without being simplistic, without being trite, without being banal, without being obvious. It's remarkable. And I don't think even Marcus Aurelius comes close to that.
Thank you, and I would like to invite you all for a drink in our courtyard where we can continue the discussion, but first of all, let's thank again Horace Engdahl.